Hello and welcome or welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to talk about the pros and cons between living in as an au pair and living out as an au pair. So living in means that you're living with the family and what you'd imagine a traditional host family situation to be. But living in means that you just have a bedroom in the family house. Easy peasy. Living out means that you get your own apartment, your very own place outside of the family home. Now, first of all, let me be clear about this. If you are an au pair, your family should be providing housing. So when choosing between a live out and live in family, there's a lot to think about. Some au pairs think that there's nothing to think about and that live out is the best option, hands down. I honestly disagree with this. I've lived in with both families. With my current family, I had lots of other options of families to go with, but I didn't even bother looking for a live-out situation because I really enjoyed my live-in situation in my first family, and I figured that it was a better fit for me after experiencing live-in. There are a lot of things with living out that you might not necessarily think about, but can turn out to be big cons. So first of all, let's talk about living out and go through some of the pros and the cons. The pros, obviously, you get to be a lot more independent if you're living out. You have your own space to live in. Sometimes you have your own cooking space. You can live life like a full adult, and yeah, you have your privacy. You're very separate from the family, and those are things that a lot of au pairs like. They like the idea of having their own space that is completely separate from the family, and that's why some au pairs will say, only live out, don't even consider living in with a family, like always look for a live out family. In Paris, you're going to have lots of families that will have an apartment for you and you will be able to live out, but I'm going to get into some of the cons and things that you really need to consider when considering live out. So cons for living out. You are going to be in all likelihood in what is called a chambre de bonne, which is basically like a bedroom with a shower in it, although the shower is not guaranteed, and we'll get to that in a minute. It's going to be an extremely small space, and sometimes it's in the building of the family, sometimes it's in another building, but it's not like you're going to be getting this nice big Parisian apartment to yourself. You're going to be getting something that is like smaller than a studio in many cases and has less amenities than your average studio apartment. The number one con to living out is that often you're going to find really weird setups. These are all real examples from au pairs that I know. No Wi-Fi in your chambre de bonne, no Wi-Fi where you're living. This is pretty common. I would say this is probably one of the most common problems that au pairs experience with living out. Make sure that you ask your host family if you will have access to Wi-Fi in your room. I would recommend that whether you're living in or living out, because sometimes Wi-Fi doesn't extend throughout the whole house. There are lots of girls who show up in France and realize that they have no Wi-Fi, they can't use the internet, they can't video chat with their parents, they can't do anything when they're in their own apartment. Obviously, for most people, that would probably be a deal breaker, so make sure to figure that out before you go. Second, situation is having to go through the family's apartment to get to your chambre de bonne. Because chambre de bonnes are former maids' chambers that were converted into like little tiny apartments, yeah, keep that in mind. You're gonna be literally living where the servants used to live. Sometimes you have to like go through the family's apartment to get to your chambre de bonne. Sometimes you don't have to. Another thing is that sometimes your chambre de bonne is going to be right on top of your family's apartment, so you're gonna have to be like really quiet in the night to make sure you're not stepping too hard because they can hear every single thing coming from your apartment. So a lot of times there's not the privacy that you'd think you'd be getting. It's basically like living in with those two situations. Another situation that I've heard about is, which the family did not warn her about beforehand, nor did the previous au pair, was that her bedroom and her kitchen area were literally in two separate apartments. Like she had to walk across the hall to get to her kitchen, and there was no Wi-Fi in the bedroom, only in the kitchen living room area. So yeah, you can run into some really weird setups with chambre de bonnes or live out situations. Make sure you ask a lot of questions. Make sure you ask like not only for pictures, but for a video tour. Make sure you ask as many questions as you can think of. And if your family is like, why are you asking so many questions? Tell some of these stories about situations that other au pairs have ended up in. Another thing to keep in mind is that in a chambre de bon, it's not uncommon to have a shared toilet. So I said that you would probably maybe have a shower in your bedroom area, but you're almost never going to have a toilet. That's why I say it's like a studio, but even less than a studio apartment. So a lot of au pairs have to share a toilet with other people that live in these little tiny spaces that have been converted from the maids' quarters. That means that every time you have to go to the bathroom, you have to like bring your own hand soap and your own toilet paper into the bathroom with you. So yeah, for me, that would kind of be a downer. Another thing to keep in mind is that sometimes you aren't gonna have a shower in there. There's a girl I know who has to go to her host family's apartment to shower, shares the shower with all the other people in the house because her live-out apartment is literally just a bedroom with no shower, no toilet. Those are some things to keep in mind. Now, I don't mean to be so down on living out. I think that it can be a really cool experience, but honestly, I would rather have access to a toilet and a shower where I don't have to bring my own hand soap, where I have Wi-Fi throughout the house, where I am just in a normal living situation than have to deal with all of these awkward situations that you run into often with living out. And then the other con to think about is that yes, you are more independent, but this can mean being more lonely, and especially in the context of quarantine. For me, it was absolutely essential that I was quarantined with my host family. That made my quarantine honestly enjoyable because I got to spend time with these people that I really enjoyed spending time with, versus I know some au pairs here in Paris that were actually confined without any contact with their host family. So for 3 months, there were au pairs that had to live alone in those tiny little rooms that I'm describing with no contact with their family or anyone else. And that was very, very difficult for them. I think most au pairs in that situation ended up leaving. So just different things to think about. I think that if you're a lot more social, if you like coming home and like being around other people, if you're the type of person that has liked having roommates in the past, then living in might actually be better for you. It's just something to think about yourself because it's going to depend on personality types. Okay, now let's talk about the experience of living in. Pros: more integration into the family. If you really want that like family experience, if you want to know what it's like to live in a French family, living in is probably the option for you. You're going to get to experience everyday life. You're really going to get to notice those cultural differences because you're going to be living together and sharing a space together. In the same vein, more cultural and language immersion. You're going to get a lot more immersion when you're living in. Another pro: easier access to food. You're supposed to have access to your host family's food, to their kitchen. They're supposed to feed you. That's part of the deal, just like housing. If they're not feeding you, then that is a huge red flag. Or if they're like restricting access to food to only certain like times of day or certain foods, I don't know. That I think can make for a difficult living situation. Another thing to think about is that when you are living out and you are working, you can't retreat back to your space. Like a lot of the time, my kids just want to play the two of them. Or when I have them all day after lunch, we have what's called like a quiet moment that their parents came up with where they go to their room and just play quietly alone. During that time, I can go up to my room and relax in my space. Living out, you have nowhere to go, and that's a complaint I've heard from a lot of live out au pairs, is that even when their kids are completely independent, then they can't really take advantage of being a part of the family and like just go to their own space like an older sibling would do if they're looking out after them. Like, for example, the other night I was babysitting and the parents ended up staying out a lot later than intended, and they were like, look, you can just go to bed, like you don't have to stay up arbitrarily you know, we know that you're there in the house and that's all that we need. Also, like living in, during the workday, I have access to all of my stuff. If I'm here for the whole day and they want to play just the two of them for a while, it's easy for me to run up to my room and grab a book, grab my iPad to read on, to stay productive during that downtime. Cons are that there's potentially less privacy and independence. In both situations, it's really important to find a family that you mesh well with personality-wise and values-wise, but especially if you're living in. For me, I don't feel awkward coming home at any hour of the night. You know, I'm just like not rude about it. I try not to be loud. And I try to be really thoughtful about like my host family and whether I'm going to wake them up. But at the end of the day, I'm comfortable coming home after going out with friends, you know, at whatever time that I want to. And I'm also comfortable staying out the night at friends' houses if, you know, I don't want to come back at a certain hour when the trains stop, or like I just want to stay out all night. That's fine with my host family. And not all host families would be okay with that, which can really severely impact your social life and your experience. You know, maybe I think if you're 18 or 19, you might be a little bit more flexible towards having that control, especially if you're an older au pair though, and you are like 24 like me, 25, 26, if you met 27-year-old au pairs, and you have host parents that are sometimes only 10 years older than you, trying to control when you're gonna go out, how long you're gonna go out, like that can get to be a very, very uncomfortable situation. And then another thing to think about with living in is that you can't have people over, and most likelihood you can like almost never have people over, so you're gonna have to find other places to go with your friends. But yeah, those are all things to think about with the live-in, live-out situation. I think that overall, what matters the most is that I have a really high-quality family, so I wouldn't turn down a family. That was my perspective going into this, is, you know, I'm not gonna turn down the perfect family just because it's a live-in situation. And I have that same philosophy now that I've come to really think that living in is often preferable, where I wouldn't turn down the perfect family just because they have a live-out situation. However, there are a lot of weird situations with living out that would be deal breakers for me, no matter how nice the family is. And same with live-in. If I didn't have my own shower in my room and it was 5 people all sharing one bathroom, like that would honestly be a lot. I hope that that gives you some perspective on what might work better for you living out or living in. If you have any questions about au pairing or life in France in general, be sure to comment down below. I love answering them. I love getting ideas for new videos. If you enjoyed this content, please like and subscribe.